This is Green Tide Rising, a podcast following the green wave movement in Latin America.
And how it's unveiling a blueprint for global reproductive freedom. I'm Monica Morales Garcia.
And I'm Asha Dyer. Last episode, we were in the Dominican Republic, where anti-Blackness, ableism, and xenophobia all intersected in the lives of women, girls, and people who can get pregnant, causing the Dominican diaspora 1,500 miles away to stand up for las tres cosas, knowing it's not enough.
This episode, we are in Brazil, known for Carnival and the huge Christ the Redeemer statue. In Brazil, abortion is allowed in 3 exceptions. But this summer, evangelical lawmakers were working to advance a bill that would make it illegal for victims of rape to seek abortions. With this new law, an abortion after rape would be considered homicide after 22 weeks gestation, facing more punishment than the rapist.
We are not going to put this up for a vote. This will not go through. And if it goes through, we will go to the Supreme Court to bring it down in defense of women's lives.
I first met Rebeca when she sent me a message on social media asking for help.
I decided to send an unpretentious message and wait for the reply. The message said that I had just found out that I was pregnant and that I didn't want to continue. And that someone said that this person could help me. And as incredible as it may seem, the person who replied was Professor Debora Diniz.
I'm Debora Diniz. I'm Brazilian. I'm a researcher and activist on reproductive rights.
Debora Diniz has been working in the reproductive space since the 1990s. She's also a documentarian, anthropologist, law professor, and one of the founders of ANIS, a multidisciplinary, intersectional feminist advocacy organization. They work to promote reproductive justice, citizenship, equality, and human rights for women and other vulnerable groups. So the fact that Rebeca Mendes found Debora wasn't really an accident or coincidence. Debora was helping women who needed help.
She was pregnant in Brazil and she needed an abortion, but she didn't want to go to jail and she didn't want to die.
Today, Rebeca Mendes is a 36-year-old Brazilian woman living on the outskirts of Sao Paulo, Brazil. But 6 years ago, Rebeca was scared.
That is how she herself framed the situation she was facing at the time. She was then a solo working mother of 2 young boys and a law student.
And Rebeca had never been in a situation like this.
I am from a very common family here in Brazil. I am the daughter of a single mother, and I have a younger brother. We were very poor, and I didn't have access to university education when I finished school. And like many other girls, I had to work very early.
9 million young people in Brazil between the ages of 14 and 29 do not finish high school. Rebeca was lucky to finish, but not everyone does. Over 50% of men and boys who never finish, their main reason was the necessity to work. And among women and girls, only about 25% drop out because of necessity to work, but almost an equal amount drop out because of pregnancy.
My mother was a very evangelical woman, super fundamentalist, against human rights, against abortion. So we had a very troubled relationship because we had different positions. I got married early to escape this abusive home and soon became pregnant with my first child.
By the time Rebeca was 24, she was married and had her first child. It wasn't exactly how she pictured her future, but she was trying to escape her mother's abusive home, and marriage seemed like the only way out.
2 years later came my second child, and I experienced a very lonely and painful motherhood. After my second child, I too decided that I didn't want to go through that experience again, and I wanted to provide a different life for my 2 children.
Her marriage wasn't going well. She saw where the relationship was heading, and she knew she would eventually have to leave her husband.
Mesmo morando na mesma casa do pai dos meus
Even though I
filhos,
lived in the same
ele
house
sempre
as the
foi
father of my
ausente.
children,
E
he
para
has
mim
always
sempre
been an
recaiu
absent
todo o
father.
trabalho do
And all the
cuidado.
work of caring
Durante
for
todo o
them
nosso
has always fallen to
relacionamento,
me.
sempre me foi
Throughout our
imposta a
relationship,
obrigação
I
do
was
nosso
obliged to
planejamento
plan for our
familiar.
family. So
Então
it was only my
era
responsibility to
apenas
provide
minha
contraception.
responsabilidade a
I remember
contracepção.
feeling very bad while on
Lembro
the
que eu me
contraceptive I
sentia
was
muito
taking,
mal com o
but I had
contraceptivo
no
que eu
other choice
tomava,
or other
mas não tinha
methods.
outra escolha. E outras opções de métodos.
She felt trapped, and her husband thought she should stay at home and take care of anything in the realm of the domestic. He would even demand that she stayed home and take care of their children. But Rebecca wanted to continue her studies, so, secretly, she applied to a law school scholarship. Months later, in 2014, Rebecca got the good news. She received the scholarship, and she finally had to make that hard choice. Was she going to stay with her husband, who would never let her chase this dream? Or was she going to leave?
Trabalhar e estudar nunca foram uma
Working and
opção para
studying
mim
were
dentro do
never an option
casamento.
for me
Então,
within the
quando eu
marriage.
consigo a bolsa
So
de
when I got
estudos,
the
foi uma grande
scholarship,
virada
it
na
was a
minha
big
vida.
turning point in
No
my
ano
life.
seguinte, além
The
de
following
estudar,
year,
eu
as well
comecei a
as studying,
trabalhar
I started
também.
working
Então,
too.
pela primeira vez na
So, for
minha
the
vida,
first
eu
time
não
in my
vivia
life,
em
I
um lar
wasn't living in an
abusivo e tinha
abusive
uma
home, and I
perspectiva de
had the
futuro
prospect of
melhor
a better
para mim e
future
para os
for
meus
myself and my
filhos.
children.
And in October 2017, Rebecca was switching to a new birth control. Since she had her second child, Rebecca had been using the depot shot, the injectable contraceptive method that you get every 3 months. When she was still married, her husband did not want to have a vasectomy. So, for 6 years, the depot shot was her birth control method. But due to some side effects she was beginning to deal with, she was looking to change to an IUD.
No começo de 2017, eu
At the
decidi
beginning of
trocar de novo pro
2017, I
contraceptivo e
decided to
colocar no
change my
DIU. Eu
contraceptive
achei que
method
seria
and get an IUD. I thought it
algo
would be
simples e
more
fácil
something
de ser
simple and
feito,
easy
né?
to do, right?
Porém, eu
But I
acabei me
ended up coming up
deparando com
against a
inúmeras
lot of barriers
barreiras,
and failed
várias
attempts.
tentativas frustradas.
Rebecca went to her local public hospital to get the IUD. But before she could get the procedure, doctors told her that she first needed to get her period and then have some exams, and then she needed to get an ultrasound.
And at the beginning of November that year, I found out I was pregnant.
During this small window, waiting for her exams and going through the loops of bureaucracy, Rebecca had sex with her then ex-husband. And after that one encounter, she got pregnant.
I was halfway through my law degree, and my temporary work contract was about to end. So, when I confirmed that I was pregnant, the first thing that came to mind was my future and the future of my children, right? And from that uncertainty about the future, the only certainty I had was that the pregnancy couldn't continue. I didn't know what to do, right? How was I going to have an abortion? Even though I was a feminist, abortion had never been an issue in my life.
Mesmo sendo feminista, o aborto nunca tinha sido uma questão na minha vida.
But even as this new situation presented itself, Rebecca knew continuing the pregnancy was just not an option. Here is Debora.
She knew she could try to have a clandestine abortion, but she didn't want to expose herself to those risks, including for the sake of the children. She was sure of her decision to terminate the pregnancy.
The first thing I did the day after I found out I was pregnant was to start researching how to have an abortion. I came across the world of clandestinity, and I became more desperate. The stories of women who take the risk of having an unsafe abortion permeate the imagination of all us Brazilians. We all know someone or some story of suffering caused by an unsafe abortion. I myself had a neighbor who confided me a torturous story about an abortion she'd had years before.
Rebecca found out she was pregnant November 14th. She knew right away that she did not want to continue the pregnancy, and her ex-husband wasn't super enthusiastic about it either. So he began sending her phone numbers to contact and potential clinics to call. But abortion was and still is illegal under most circumstances, and Rebecca didn't qualify for the exceptions. She didn't know what was going to happen when she made those phone calls, and that scared her. According to the Brazilian Ministry of Health, every 2 days a Brazilian woman dies as a result of an unsafe abortion. Rebecca had heard the horror stories of women dying or being scammed out of a month's rent for fake misoprostol.
It sounds crazy, but when you're in this situation, you end up getting very paranoid, right? On the one hand, I had the options on the internet, which could just be scammers. And on the other hand, I had these telephone contacts, where I lacked the courage to call and ask.
She began to feel crazy and paranoid, like she was going to call those phone numbers and the police was going to answer and then show up at her house and arrest her. But then
I realized that one of the phone contacts was also a WhatsApp contact.
And you know it. One of those phone numbers she dialed was Debora Diniz.
In that first conversation with Debora, I talked about what was happening to me and my decision not to continue with that pregnancy. And she, in turn, told me about her work, such as the Supreme Court case calling for the decriminalization of abortion up to the 12th week. We talked a lot at the time, and when I asked her how she could help me, the answer I got was that we could file a request within that lawsuit so that I could have access to a legal and safe abortion, even though I didn't fit the legal requirements. So from that moment on, I found what I had been looking for, which was an option that would take away all the risks that terrified me. Even if the litigation route didn't work out, Debora had told me that leaving the country and going to a country where I could have the right to have a legal abortion would be an option. At that moment, I wanted to solve my problem in a safe way, and I didn't care if I had to face the law or a Supreme Court to do so.
Enfrentar a lei ou uma Suprema Corte.
And 10 days later, in a letter to the Brazilian Supreme Court, which she read out loud and posted to YouTube,
Meu nome é Rebeca, tenho 30 anos, sou mãe de 2 meninos, Thomas de 9
she asked the Brazilian Supreme Court if they could authorize her to have an abortion. The action was drawn up by several feminist organizations, including Anis. They argued that the criminalization of abortion violates the fundamental rights guaranteed in the Constitution, such as dignity, freedom, and health.
And she was ready to take her case to the courts, which is what we did end to end.
Rebeca was the first woman in Brazil to ask the state for permission to end the pregnancy. But time was ticking, and by the end of December, there was no response. Rebeca's pregnancy was only advancing, and she wanted to end the pregnancy in the first trimester.
Ultimately, the Brazilian judicial system didn't respond to her demands in time, and she had a legal abortion in Colombia.
Justice Rose Weber, one of the 2 women who sat on Brazil's 11-member Supreme Court back then, denied her request on procedural grounds. But she did not rule on the merits of Rebeca's request. But like Debora promised, Rebeca would be taken care of no matter what.
But her courage to share her own experience when that is as common as it is silenced changed the public debate around abortion rights in Brazil.
This is Green Tide Rising. Stay with us. Hey, Monica.
Hey, Asha, and welcome, everyone, to episode 6 of Green Tide Rising. In this episode, we are in Brazil. And like Argentina, Brazil is one of the countries that is on the forefront of reproductive rights, but not because of any laws.
As we've seen in other countries where abortion is criminalized or severely restricted, it can have a far-reaching impact throughout a pregnant person's life. We'll be hearing more about this from our resident Green Wave expert and human rights lawyer, Ximena Casas, whose study tracking the trends and impact of abortion criminalization across Latin America and the Caribbean is a clear message about why abortion bans are dangerous for everyone.
The fear of criminal prosecution, both for the pregnant people and for the providers, and those who accompany this woman and people that wants to terminate their pregnancy, is a major barrier to access these essential healthcare services. We have found that the criminalization does not only include imprisonment, but also the path of reporting and prosecuting that has a long effect on the woman's life. It affects them in all areas of their life, in their personal life, in their family life, as a mother, as a worker, and as a part of the community.
She's talking about people like Rebeca. But on the flip side, the restrictive landscape can also lead to some really innovative methods. It's like a pressure cooker.
Back in the 80s, misoprostol was a popular medication for stomach ulcers.
Debora Diniz, a NIS founder, feminist anthropologist, and researcher, again.
Brazilian women were the ones who discovered the use of misoprostol for abortions. Brazil has a tradition of wide access to over-the-counter drugs and a strong presence of popular pharmacies at the community level.
In the 80s, misoprostol was sold over the counter. It was as easy as purchasing Tylenol.
Brazil has a tradition of wide access to over-the-counter drugs and a strong presence of popular pharmacies at the community level. For many people, the most basic step when in need of healthcare was in the 80s and 90s, and it still is today to some extent, to go to the nearest drugstore and ask the pharmacists what they should take for what they need.
Originally, the pill was intended for folks dealing with ulcers, but that quickly changed.
Women started to experiment with misoprostol to induce abortions. Community pharmacists played a role in helping define basic standards for abortion management, such as pairing misoprostol with painkillers and antibiotics, and keeping an eye out for signs of infection through symptoms like long-lasting heavy bleeding and fever.
It's not known who was the first woman or women, or maybe pharmacists, that figured out the double use for misoprostol, but it's commonly thought that Black and Indigenous Brazilian women in the northern region of Brazil figured out best practices.
The uptake of abortion pills in Brazil was not a doctor-centric process. It was truly led by ordinary women's needs, creativity, and agency. The discovery of the misoprostol is an element of the chapter of women seeking solutions by themselves to avoid being dependent on institutions and medical power.
That's because there's this huge class gap in Brazil. And in turn, that reveals some of the inequalities in the healthcare system throughout the region. This is something we've seen over and over again in each country's respective Green Wave movement. Rich Latinas, which often means white Latinas, they find ways to get reproductive care throughout Latin America. There's even a saying for it: Las mujeres ricas abortan, las pobres se mueren.
Before misoprostol, self-managed abortion was performed with extremely risky procedures, such as inserting sharp objects and hangers in the womb, drinking poison or a mixture of herbs. But it was always important to remember that the risky reality was common among poor Black and brown women. Wealthy women accessed abortion in their private doctor's offices with no risk, even got their abortions in France and the US. But since 1940, abortions are only legal in Brazil in cases of rape or risk to life. In 2012, a third but very limited exception in cases of fetal anencephaly was granted by the Supreme Court.
So Brazil has the 3 exceptions to abortion, but
Abortion is criminalized.
this is Marina Coutinho. She's a lawyer and is a strategic litigation analyst who conducts research at ANIS. Yes, the same ANIS that Debora Diniz founded back in 1999. So today in Brazil, abortion is criminalized with up to 3 years in jail. And if you are a doctor caught providing an abortion, the sentence is up to 4 years. But Marina says the rules vary by how much money you have.
Porque las mujeres que tienen plata. Porque eu confundo plata com plátano.
Because women who have money can access private services. Because they exist and have professionals that do this type of care for a lot of money and are not concerned that you are an abortionist or whatever.
La criminalización de aborto
The criminalization of abortion generates a market for many professionals that charge a lot of money for their services. So, the people who have money access the best services and are not struggling with criminalization, being suspected and stigmatized.
This is Raquel Luzosa. She's a social scientist and is also a strategic litigation analyst, conducting research for ANIS. Raquel and Marina work together fighting for reproductive freedom throughout Brazil. Here is Marina again.
However, there are many professionals who provide abortions in a very respectful way that fulfills all the protocols. But these professionals are being persecuted in Brazil right now. We have very few services that provide legal abortions because many barriers are created around legally conducting the procedure, especially in cases of sexual violence. After all, when the abortion stems from a life risk or a non-viable pregnancy, people can access the service at any moment. But in the cases of sexual violence, there is a series of barriers that are imposed onto the service providers and medical professionals so that they can't do it. And the professionals are very afraid of being criminalized and held responsible.
And like we mentioned at the top of the episode, this year, over the summer, Evangelical lawmakers have been working to advance a bill that, if passed, would treat the termination of a pregnancy after 22 weeks as homicide. The bill was proposed by conservative lawmakers and is currently headed for a vote in the lower house. It was kind of a shocking pendulum swing to the right, as just last year, feminists felt closer than ever to decriminalizing abortion in Brazil.
But just months ago, back in June, demonstrators gathered in front of Brazil's National Congress to protest the bill. They came bearing green bandanas and banners with the slogan, "A child is not a mother." This focus on young girls was purposeful, as critics of the bill have pointed out that most of the people who seek abortions late in pregnancy are usually children who have been victims of rape. And going through with this bill, it would punish the most vulnerable Brazilians. It would not prevent abortions, but it would potentially mean that convicted rapists could receive lesser jail sentences than their victims. So Brazilian girls are really vulnerable on many fronts, and not every girl understands or knows her rights.
Niñas y adolescentes que pasan por una situación de violencia muchas veces.
Girls and teenage women, many of whom suffered through violent situations, seek abortion services that should be legal. But when they arrive at their medical provider and are lucky enough to run into a doctor who understands the legality and implications of their case, interrupts their pregnancy and reports the fact to Child Protective Services. These services, which should protect children and investigate the violence committed against them, instead report the case as an illegal abortion, stating that the child wanted to keep the pregnancy. So it is very delicate because there is no strong concept of what constitutes a life risk for young women. So many of them die even though they should have the right to access abortion services.
Conceito sobre o que é risco de vida de niñas y adolescentes. Entonces, muitas mulheres acabam morrendo, mesmo tendo direito a acessar.
Conservative lawmakers who are proposing this bill have been dubbed, quote, the rape caucus by activists because they feel lawmakers are playing politics at the expense of women, girls, and people who can get pregnant, just to boost voter turnout and support from evangelical voters, who today make up the majority of voters in Brazil.
Yo creo que la mayor cuestión es porque Brasil es un país muy católico y las religiones evangélicas.
I think that the biggest reason is that Brazil is a very Catholic country. With the Pentecostal communities having grown a lot in the past 20 years, they have grown a lot, have many fronts and a lot of influence, especially in Congress. Because we have a lot of members of the Pentecostal faith and other religions who are very prejudiced and want to impose their personal beliefs on others through politics and take away their rights. So today, our Congress is very influenced by religion.
Crenças personales en las políticas, en la vida de las otras personas. Entonces, hoy nuestro Congreso tiene una influencia religiosa muy grande.
But fortunately, even if this bill passes through the lower house, it would have to be signed by President Lula da Silva, who has called the bill insanity, rightly so. But still, this show of strength from conservatives in Congress about how far they are willing to go if they regain control is telling. And as someone who grew up conservative evangelical, I can tell you firsthand, they do not give up easily when they have a certain goal in mind, and they are organized. We've seen this in the United States, where they set their sights on overturning Roe v. Wade and won.
For now, there are still 3 exceptions in Brazil. But feminist organizers have been creating strategic litigation to counter the revolving door of political leaders progressing and threatening regression. So, since 2017, around the time that Rebeca Mendes, the law student and mother of 2 who had to cross borders to Colombia to get her abortion, Anís also helped file ADPF 44-2. Here is Marina from Anís again.
It is a constitutional action to decriminalize abortion in our country up to the 12th week of gestation. The proposed action was put forth in 2017 by a political party called PSOL, a Brazilian social party, which had the support of Anís in writing it. So, it's been available for judgment since 2017, but it was only put up for judgment last year. So last year, the Supreme Court minister that was in charge of the case, Rosa Weber.
The same Rosa Weber that denied Rebeca's abortion.
Ella proferiu voto.
She voted a vote in favor of the decriminalization of abortion in our country. It was a beautiful vote. It spoke of social justice, of how the law is not efficient in prohibiting the practice of abortion, and how it puts women in very vulnerable situations. It was a very good vote, a vote for the decriminalization of abortion. However, later she retired, and the ruling is suspended for now.
And o julgamento está suspenso por ahora.
So, unfortunately, ADPF 442 is in limbo until the newest justice in charge takes up the vote. But that hasn't happened. Not yet.
But all the public debate is very important, so that we pressure the court into bringing the case back into judgment as fast as possible. We don't know when this is going to happen, but we have a lot of hope that this is the way that abortion is going to be decriminalized in our country.
But in the meantime, women do what they can. They self-manage their abortions with misoprostol, or even travel beyond their nation's borders. Today, women in Brazil can travel south to Argentina, where abortion is now legal up to 14 weeks, which we talked about in episode 1. But back in 2017, Argentina only allowed the procedure in cases of rape or if the person's life was in danger. So Rebeca went to Colombia, where in 2017, termination of a pregnancy was permitted as a safeguard to a pregnant person's mental health. Here is Rebeca recalling that experience when she had to cross borders for reproductive care.
The experience at the clinic was a unique experience in my life, because there I found everything I couldn't access in my country. I would have a safe abortion and leave with the contraceptive method I had chosen. But going back a bit in the story, until the morning of the day we were scheduled to have the procedure, I hadn't worried about what the procedure would be like or anything like that. I was so nervous and anxious about getting there, about the real possibility of having an abortion, that the question of how it would be done hadn't even crossed my mind. In addition to the feelings I've mentioned, I gained a great deal of trust for the group of women who were helping me and who got me there. That allowed me the privilege of worrying about the procedure only on the day of the appointment. But even on that day, I felt welcomed, listened to, and respected by the team who attended to me at the clinic. It was a feeling I could never have imagined.
Foi uma sensação que eu nunca poderia ter imaginado.
After the procedure, abortion became a political issue for her. It was less a matter of morality and more a healthcare issue and a human right. Today, she feels lucky that Debora was on the other side of that WhatsApp number and that she wasn't forced into having another child or forced into having an unsafe abortion.
Today, Rebeca is a well-known abortion activist in Brazil through her organization Projeto Vivas and helps women with the resources needed for their reproductive care.
Projeto Vivas arose from this need of so many other women who need abortion care. Today, we are an organization that connects those who need abortion care with legal abortion services in and outside of Brazil. Basically, our job is to take care of countless girls and women in the same way that Debora and the Diniz researchers took care of me back then.
Crossing borders to access abortion care is about crossing borders to foster solidarity.
As Debora explains, being forced to cross a border to access care isn't just a physical or financial burden. It also speaks volumes about whether the state views you as a human being.
And for women and people who can become pregnant and travel to Argentina, this has only made the absurd of the legal restrictions and bodily autonomy more evident and absurd. On this one side of the border, if you need to terminate a pregnancy, you may have to go to unsafe and costly methods while risking criminal charges, like going to jail. On the other side of the border, terminating a pregnancy is now finally recognized as a health need, one that merits dignified, respectful care, just like any other health need.
Rebeca's experience is similar to what many women and pregnant people are currently forced to do in the United States. But this moment of people being pissed off and enraged about this dehumanizing landscape is the foundation to movement building.
What we see now in the U.S. across the states, or in the border between U.S. and Mexico, or even between Brazil and Argentina, for example, is how women build resilience and connections to protect their lives and rights.
No matter what the law is in a country, people will always need abortions, and people will always find a way to get them. And in that process, some become activists and leaders, wanting to help others. Rebeca's experience is a powerful reminder of the impact one person's story can have when spoken out loud. It's a ripple effect that can become a wave.
The stories that we hear about how ordinary women protect other ordinary women in their life needs and rights are really amazing. In a different dimension is the repetition of what our ancestors did when pills were not available to abortion or when the methods were really unsafe. What we see is women connecting women to share solutions and care.
I truly love the notion of ordinary women becoming a beacon of hope for other ordinary women. You know, when we come up against barriers, we find the innovative solutions, which can open up a world of opportunity to see progress on abortion rights and bodily autonomy.
Our resident Green Wave expert and feminist human rights lawyer and researcher, Ximena Casas, has talked about this in previous episodes. Go listen back if you need to. Here, she shares more about the importance of fighting for access to medication abortion and the documented positive effect when it is readily available.
According to the World Health Organization abortion guidelines, the combination of mifepristone and misoprostol is 95% effective to end unintended pregnancies that are 13 weeks or less. But what other research and what other practices has shown us is that the abortion pill is becoming a way to provide women with access of the healthcare that they need. The telemedicine has been essential, and especially after the pandemic, to guarantee the access. We are seeing in countries where abortion pills are available that there is a reduction of maternal deaths, that early terminations of the pregnancy happen in the first trimester. So we are seeing the impact and the good lessons that the abortion pills is giving us, and how this is a way to provide reproductive autonomy and empower women.
So if the World Health Organization has publicly declared the safety and positive impact of medication abortion, how are countries responding? And what's the responsibility of the U.S.? Because we're one of the few countries going in the opposite direction of global trends on abortion. And even while Roe v. Wade existed, we had another law in the books that decimated global funding and access to abortion.
As a global superpower, the U.S., and as a founder, with Roe in place and safe and legal abortions available in the U.S., the country imposed the Helms Amendment, which was signed almost 50 years ago. And this is an amendment of the foreign assistance that prohibits the use of foreign assistance to pay for the performance of abortion or to motivate any person to practice abortion. And in practice, the Helms Amendment has also been used to prohibit the use of federal funding for all abortions, even in the circumstances of rape, incest, or the risk to the life of the pregnant person. So now that you don't have the protections of Roe in the United States, and so many countries around the world are making abortion safe and legal, other countries and activists, we are confused by what we are seeing that is happening in the U.S. So the U.S. is going against this trend to protect abortion rights and is now allying with other countries like Poland, and the United States is failing now to comply with these international human rights obligations and standards to ensure that pregnant people have access to abortion.
I feel we can't underscore enough that the fight for abortion access must be inclusive and advocate for people on the margins, as they are often the most impacted by bans, not only in the US, but globally. Ximena, given what we've heard about Rebeca's story in this episode of having to travel to another country, can you explain the implications for immigrants, especially when seeking abortion care?
So imagine that you are in a country as an immigrant, or you are in a country where abortion is not legal. If you have the economic resources, you will be able to travel to another country to receive the services. But if you don't have the income, or because of your immigration status, you cannot leave the country, you will not be able to get access to that safe services. So you will be incarcerated in a country without any options. And that's why it may happen that you ended up with unsafe procedure, or you ended up with a forced motherhood, with unintended pregnancy. And when you create this, you are creating these discriminatory actions and policies that will affect more vulnerable people. And that's why what we are advocating is that we need to be advocating for all, and we need to make sure that we have all these lens into account so we can take into consideration the many situations that people may be living, and why it's important that it's affordable and accessible to all the people.
Okay, the United States is at an inflection point for the future of reproductive rights, and the upcoming election is going to determine a lot. for immigrants, for abortion seekers, for everyone. What we know for sure is that the green wave is pointing us in the direction we need to go. And the United States should be paying attention.
In the last 30 years, there have been 60 countries that have liberalized abortion. And since 2018, the green wave in Latin America has brought these groundbreaking decisions and legislations to protect and advance on abortion rights. So I think it is time to see what we from the Global South have to offer. We need to stop thinking only on the superpower nation, which also perpetuates colonialism, and start seeing what we as Latin American movement have done to protect and advance on reproductive autonomy.
Countries like Brazil and the United States may be considered global superpowers in the economic sense. But with Roe v. Wade now gone, and Brazil only having 3 exceptions to abortion and not issuing a ruling on the impending Supreme Court case, I think it's time we reevaluate the notion of what makes a nation powerful.
Oh yes, and everything we are seeing with the green wave movement is showing us a blueprint for how to build power in new ways by placing human rights at the center of what we want to achieve with bodily autonomy. This is the time for the global north to listen to voices of leadership from the global south.
We've spent the first 6 episodes looking at various strategies and successes of the green wave in a number of different countries. And in episode 7, we're taking that to the next level.
While we're doing the policy work that's happening, while we're doing the organizing work, it's we coming together as a community independently of what's going on outside and taking care of one another. It is the only way forward.
Join us next time on Green Tide Rising, where we will be holding a roundtable discussion with green wave leaders, including our very own Ximena Casas and other reproductive justice organizers and advocates, to get a look at the inner workings of the green wave, the many years it took to get where they are now, some of the badass actions these women have been undertaking, and of course, suggestions for what we can all do to bring the green wave to our shore. This episode was produced and written by Monica Morales Garcia.
Special thanks to Ximena Casas and Bipa Lucci for additional Brazilian Portuguese translation support.
Green Tide Rising is executive produced by Jess Jacobs and Leela Meadow-Connor, with associate producer Adi Biaringer.
And produced in partnership with Pod People.
Our theme music was composed by Andres Aspiri.
I'm your host, Monica Morales Garcia.
And I'm your host and executive producer, Asha Dyer.
Join us again on Green Tide Rising. And in the meantime, head over to our YouTube channel to watch and share our accompanying video series, Entonces. Link in the show notes.
You can also find us on social media and see more about this episode on our website, greentiderising.com. Subscribe and listen wherever you get your podcasts. Bye for now.
Adios.